This is session 2, and I'd like to welcome you to this session. Dr. Ruan O'Donnell, who's just coming up onto the platform, will examine 1918 as a decisive year for the modern world, and then Liz Gillis. I told you last night about Donald Fallon having the accident, and unfortunately Donald had to undergo, I think he underwent surgery, but anyway he wasn't able to attend, and I think we should wish him well and hope he gets well soon. Liz who's in the audience, is going to extend her talk to cover most of the areas that Donald would have covered this afternoon. And I particularly welcome the chair of today's session, Deputy Eamon O'Keefe, who, as I say, will chair this session. Eamon is a long-serving TD and the Fianna Fáil representative for Galway West. He's a minister in many capacities, including Minister for the Islands and the Gaeltacht, which I would imagine was probably his most personally satisfying ministry. He's also taken a keen interest in prison issues in the north and in northern jails, and the condition and problems of prisoners in northern jails. I remember when we were involved, some of you may remember Bobby Heatley, who was a participant in schools, and sadly no longer with us, and Joe Deegan, and we always found Eamon was very, when we were involved with trying to set up a non-sectarian democracy campaign in the north, Eamon would meet and would listen to what we had to say. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Eamon to get the meeting going.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation to chair this session, and to say that I think summer schools like this that look at history and then look at current affairs and maybe think a little bit outside of the box of what's standard thinking at the moment are very, very important. Is there an going to figure out the Canadian school to a million nedi go hochtek? Or how go Laura nading or on two fossil for the down a data and seal go Hulwana? Could you go Kunasa because could you go Kundocher? I have to say that the subject that Ruan is undertaking today is absolutely challenging to encompass the world history of 1918 in a talk here this morning, but no better man to do it. And of course, the wider events of 1918 on the European and the world scale had a huge effect on Ireland as well. Now, Ruan is one of our best known historians in the University of Limerick, and he's written several books about the 1798 period. He edited the series on the 16 lives of the leaders of the 1916 Rising and wrote the book on Pearse in that series. And of course we're in the house that both the Pearse brothers and their sister Senator Margaret Pearse and the rest of the family grew up in. I was given a number of years ago a book by a friend of mine, written I think it was by Bridget the sister, about their childhood in this very, very house and the dramas they played and the life they had here, when not only the mother but obviously the father was alive. And I have to say it's, I think, very historic for all of us to come back here today. I I've had considerable contact with Rowan over the years. Last year he gave a lecture on the 1917 by-election in Clare at my request. But I also wrote the foreword for two books that Rowan might remember. Himself and me, Hay asked me to write the foreword. Rowan wrote the introduction, and it was a reissuing of the F.X. Martin's book on the hosting cool gun running and the founding of the volunteers. And I have to say I was deeply honoured to be asked to write a new introduction, or not an introduction but a new foreword. So without further ado, because I think the chair should be like a good referee, not be too prominent, I think it's my great pleasure to introduce Ron, and as well as that, when we're finished we'll have a question and answer session, but it will be questions and answers. I don't care how long Rowan goes, but the questions will be short, I guarantee you. So without further ado, I'll ask Rowan to take the floor.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Yes, we have a lot of interaction the last few years, and hopefully we'll for many more. I was asked by my colleagues to speak about 1918 in this international context, and not really to touch on Ireland, because Liz will do that later, and it's terrific she's here to do that. But you can never start, no, historians can never start where they're meant to. So bear with me for a couple of minutes while I talk about 1914. Because whilst I don't profess to be an expert on the First World War, I certainly am not. I've always been interested in it. And it's something that was always on the curriculum, and members of my own family took part in it, and we had a common story in Ireland. It's something that always sort of piqued my interest. But the more you read about it, the more you realise everything you were told when you were small is not true. And that there's vastly more things you were never told that you should have been. And judgments that were predicated on faulty reasoning are absolute nonsense, and they are sort of the fallout of wartime propaganda. Because wartime propaganda has a habit of being very, very ingrained. Because it's not just that you're getting one stream of information, you're also being censored. So, and they are durable. Now, that's the First World War. We've got to go to the Second World War yet, which is even more subject to myth and propaganda. But in 1914, if you think about this, the world looked very different than it does now. The British Empire was extremely extensive, at that time very wealthy. The Raj was still functioning insofar as the British could control it. And as to paraphrase Brendan Bean's quip, the sun never set the British Empire because God didn't trust them in the dark. But it was a very impressive administrative military undertaking, and it was absolutely military. You had derived by virtue of having the Army of India, the biggest single constituent of the British Armed Forces, the Imperial Forces, which was at times was 60% Irish recruited, and nearly 100% Irish officers, particularly some of those famous Ulster General families, but not just them. Now, by 1918, the empire got slightly bigger, and I'll come to that, but they're in terminal decline, which was hastened by the Second World War, and they were catapulting from being a great power, superpower effectively, into a minor power. By 1918, they lost 42 million in gold reserves. Now, they spent much more than that, but gold reserves is one way you can look at the comparative expenditure of major organised industrialised economies, and I'll say a bit more about that. Germany was a bigger country than it is now. They had footholds in Africa, quite considerable ones in Africa actually. There's some in the Pacific and some in China, and they're continuing to gradually negotiate and acquire things, generally by negotiation, not so much invasion. The British and the French prefer to invade people. The Germans prefer to bribe, cajole, encourage, and bring them on side with deals and this and that. Now, by 1918, they began to lose, 14% of their landmass, all their colonies. 7 million people who in 1914 were considered German were not considered German by 1919. They lost about 30% of their industry, and if the French had their way, they would have lost all their industry. But we'll come to that. So that's a catastrophic hit. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist. It ceased to exist. Virtually spanning everywhere from virtually the edges of the Baltic states all the way through to Eastern Europe. Middle Europa imploded completely, and new circumstances came into being. Now, that had been a long-term British war aim to destroy the Habsburg Empire, and in that regard they succeeded comprehensively. Another great empire, albeit one in serious decline then, was the Ottoman or the Turkish Empire, which was also astoundingly extensive. Now, it was on the way down. No longer did they have an iron grip on the North African coast, but they're still important in and around the eastern Mediterranean. And of course, this is the hinterland of the Suez Canal, which can hardly be stressed in terms of its importance psychologically and practically to the British and others. So the Ottoman Empire was still a player. And as you know, attempts to destroy them failed. And a certain type of Turk came out of that fighting fit and stronger. And ultimately it proved impossible to impose war terms on the Turks because they're going to go back to war if it came to it. And of course, lastly, but not by no means least, the Russian Tsarist Empire had disintegrated with also seismic effects. Now, any one of those would be significant in its own right. But all of this happening at one time, it's to my mind unprecedented. I can't think of another period of time where so much happened so quickly on a global level. Because of course the countries we're talking about, the economies I'm discussing and outline, all had a global reach, or basically they affected the global empire, the global economy. That was not meant to happen. If you look at what was the First World War about, what was it meant to be about, the stated war aims of the great powers, all of which wanted to fight. And let's be clear about that, they all wanted to fight. There's no reluctant participants in that war. I mean, you might say Serbia didn't want to be in the war, but even then you'd have to put a question mark over that because they fought several wars in the 1910s in the Balkan sector, so they probably did. All the great powers did want to fight. But the reasons they said they were doing so in 1914 were not reflected in the settlements predicated on the victories of 1918. It's a completely different set of criteria, and that's what I'll look at in just thumbnail sketch detail, because there isn't time to do more. You can tell something of the mythology by looking at how the war broke out. Now, just for the sake of 2 minutes, let me just go through a tiny quick chronology. It was always assumed, and sometimes stated, that Germany started the First World War. Well, that is, of course, factually incorrect. They did not. Britain declared war on Germany. Right? The serious slide towards disaster could probably be traced to 23rd July 1914, when the Austrians demanded the restitution of Gavrilo Princip and the elements of his nationalist grouping from the Serbs, who were not going to comply. But when 2 days later they mobilized the army, the Serb, which was then a very experienced and quite hardened, small but effective army, that was an act of war. Mobilizing on a prospective enemy's border is internationally recognized as an act of war. It was. People go to war because things like that happen. And that's what happened. On the 29th of July, the Austrians invaded. Now that should have been another in a series of smallish, contained, limited Balkan wars, which had been very common in 1905, 06, 1910, the Pig War. All these things were happening, often involving the same countries. Bulgaria and Serbia were fighting. Bulgaria was mushrooming from a massive country to a small. The Hungarians were a different constitution they are now. There's 300,000 Hungarians in Serbia now. Well, how did that happen? Right? It's not by accident. So there were lots of limited small wars, but this one flared. And one reason was the British were determined to attack the Germans. So on the same day that the Austrians invaded, the Royal Navy went to war stations in the North Sea. That's another act of war. That's an act of war against the Germans by the British. Now again, today's topic is not about why did the war happen. It's just how remarkably different what really happened from our worldview. The following day, Russia mobilized, which of course was another threat to the Germans. And on the following day, the Austrian forces mobilized. And remember, the Austrians were already fighting the Serbs, but they hadn't fully mobilized their army, because they hadn't intended for a large-scale campaign then. Timing was an issue. Then things began to get spiraled out of control. Germany invaded Luxembourg on the 2nd. And on the 4th of August, they invaded Belgium to get to France. The Germans had nothing against the Belgians or the Luxembourgers. They wanted to get to the French frontier, which of course they then did. But on the 4th of August, Britain declared war on Germany, bringing the entire empire into a global conflict. Now, the system of alliances is certainly a factor there. The position of where would Italy be was unsettled right the way through 1915. Could have been very different if they sided with the difference with the central powers from the start. We'll come to that. It becomes capricious. And then you're down to who can resolve localized victories and who can sustain strategic gains. And that was totally in flux all the way through into 1918. I mean, just as I'm sure you're aware, the Allies came closer to losing the war in the spring of 1918 than they'd had at any time since the initial German offensive and the stabilisation of the frontier on the Battle of the Marne. The second Battle of the Marne was an Allied victory, and that laid the basis for the ultimate Allied victory. But it was a near known thing. I mean, when you have German forces within 40 miles of Paris in 1918, you're in trouble. And this is the context, of course, for our conscription crisis and things like that. There's all this was part of the same issue. Now, during the war, you can start to see shifting interests beginning to collide. Germany had been required by Britain and others to restore the sovereignty of Belgium, Luxembourg, occupied France, and that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, they're taking the part of an aggression in that sector, and of course that would have to be undone in some way. That's a reasonable war aim to state. But in 1915 you start having a look, for instance, at some of the bigger games in play, the secret agreements, ad hoc versions of alliances. So in 1915, in the context of the Dardanelles campaign of April that year, you have Russia being promised Constantinople in the event of doing the right thing in that campaign on behalf of the Allies. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Oh, they can have Constantinople, can they? And part of the Dardanelles. The Italians were also promised part of the Dardanelles, the Dalmatian coast, modern Croatia, parts of Albania, and parts of Turkey. Great. Oh, we'll have that, please. And other things like this. This is one of a whole series of these secret deals. This is one we happen to know about. Many of them, by the way, are completely incompatible. Ultimately, Palestine, or Fortress of Palestine, was offered to 3 different sets of powers by the same British government, including the Faisal dynasty. Right? You couldn't make it up. And there are all sorts of intrigues, many of which were completely incoherent and, as I said to you, nearly capricious. Now, in 1916, things like the disaster on the Somme and the rise of Lord George changed the sort of the tenor of the British approach to the war. And similarly, of course, in 1917, you have the very timely, from a certain perspective, intervention of the United States of America. Now, in 1917, they became what's called an associated power, and the type of status that they were prepared to accept or demand is telling, because they had no intention of a long-term physical presence in Europe, and indeed they didn't. And that became markedly the case in 1918 with the midterm elections in November of that year. By October, of course, things have changed remarkably on the Eastern Front. The Tsarist armies have begun to disintegrate completely. You have the rise of the Bolsheviks and the kernel of what became the Red Army. You have the imposition of not one but 2 treaties of Brest-Litovsk, both of which were horrendous in terms of what they outlined, which of course were revoked in November 1918. But we know that because that's how the greater strategic picture played itself out by November 1918. In 1917, you could say we want to revoke the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but you couldn't do it. It wasn't possible to achieve it, but it was by 1918. So just to give you a couple of pointers here. In the year 1918, it starts quite neatly, I suppose, if you want to call it that, on the 8th of January, with the articulation of what are known as the 14 points in Congress by President Woodrow Wilson, Democratic president. Now that was effectively a blueprint for how the Americans viewed the post-war global empires, and indeed their own place in it. No doubt it went through many drafts. It had been largely agreed in all principles in 1917. This was the basis for the entry to the war, and this was effectively legalizing it retrospectively in Congress. But they're quite interesting, particularly when you bear in mind that when the war ended on the 11th of November 1918 in the European sector, that is, it didn't end everywhere then. The Allies had only just, the British and the French had only just barely decided to accept the 14 points. Prior to that, they were opposed to them because of their anti-imperialist nature and content. So the point 1, by the way, I'll go through them very quickly, and I'll summarise them, would be the peace agreement should be publicly and openly made and not subject to subsequent secret dealings. So in other words, there will be some form of conference that will be public. Now, of course, we know that did not happen. It happened behind closed doors in places like Brussels, London, not just Paris, not just the suburbs of Paris, but all over Europe. The Germans and the Austrians were not privy to it. Basically speaking, the Allies were deciding what was going to be landed on the plate of their defeated enemies. The second one was a really, really controversial, that there would be freedom of the seas in peace as well as in wartime, and also freedom of access to the Dardanelles Straits. Now, the issue of the Kyle Canal and the Suez Canal had already been settled by previous international agreements, but the Dardanelles had not. And of course the Turkish proved to be extremely effective in defending the Dardanelles Straits, which had a knock-on effect, of course, on the position of Russia. Now, freedom of the seas, by the way, means you cannot blockade. But that's what the British like doing. That's what the British were doing in 1918 and 1917 and 1916 in the North Sea of the Germans. And not just military shipments, all shipments. I mean, they're doing their best to destroy the German economy, and they certainly badly damaged it by their blockades. That's what imperialists like. That's the whole point of having your dreadnoughts and your bigger navy and your 2-power standard, your 3-power standard. It's so you can blockade. It's not literally about shipping manpower around the globe. It's also about stressing your interests in a military way through international waters. Point 3 was that all economic barriers within reason should be abolished. Well, my God, they're still talking about NAFTA. But that would have meant that what happened in Austro-Hungary could not have happened, because effectively a vast array of new economic impediments, tariffs, customs, currencies were imposed on the former constituent elements of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the aftermath of the First World War. That didn't happen. The 5th point was that colonial claims should be settled with a view to the well-being of the subject population. So yes, they acknowledged that many great powers had countries that they shouldn't have, but they did have. But they encouraged them to take some account of the interests of the locals. Well, that's not self-determination. That's a way of reforming the administration of colonies. That's not in itself a blanket approval of self-determination principle. Now, points 6, 7, 8 and 11 stated that Russia, Belgium, France, Serbia, Romania and Montenegro should be restored to freedom because they're all under partial occupation by the Central Powers. Well, that's an obvious one. People could get behind that. The next one was 9, that Italy's borders should be adjusted to reflect national boundaries and natural boundaries. That's effectively an invitation to take parts of Austria, which they did, and actually preempted parts of the post-war agreements by doing so. You could have a lecture on that on its own. There's a huge amount of content in here. The 10th was that the constituent elements of Austria and Hungarian Empire should have self-determination. Oh, great! So they've got to have self-determination. What about the British Empire? Can we have self-determination in the British Empire? Oh, no, just the Austrians. Because, of course, when you talk about Hungary, you really mean Vienna. You really still mean Vienna even when you're talking about Hungary. And 12 was that non-Turkish parts of the Ottoman Empire should be allowed to exercise self-determination. That's fine, but this reflects popular issues in American politics, in Western politics in general, and those interests. And just that, nothing else. It's not consistent, although it may sound reasonable. And here's one that's clearly straight out of American domestic interests at this point in an election year, that the Polish people should have a Polish state. Well, no one could probably say no to that, but the Polish state sometimes included Lithuania, and later would gain Gdansk, Danzig. So what type of Polish state? Is it the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, or is it the former Polish Empire? Where is the Polish state going to end? Is it going to include territories that were under the control of Moscow and St. Petersburg? Where is the Polish state going to be exactly? And that, of course, did lead to a series of wars connected to the Russian Civil War and beyond it. And finally, the 14th point was that an international organisation should be formed to guarantee the territorial integrity and independence of all states. That became the League of Nations. But the League of Nations, as projected, never happened. And even the United Nations variant is still a very weak version of the type of strong League of Nations originally envisioned, which would have had a military annex. Now, the League of Nations, by the way, did work quite well in repatriation of prisoners in global health issues at the time of the global Spanish flu pandemic. It did work quite well in administering Danzig, for instance. I mean, it did function quite well. But if the original view had been that would have the capacity effectively to initiate military action where necessary, the French would have been placated. The French would have approached the German situation and German revisionism differently, and everything else, as we know it, would not have occurred. But we're getting dangerously closer to what if-ry. Just to point out that the 14 points were accepted by Congress, barely accepted by the Allies with reservations, and never happened. Some of it happened, but much of it didn't. Well, moving along, you'll notice that's what's not in the 14 points. There's no talk of altering the territorial integrity of Germany. There's no talk of war guilt or reparations or anything of the sort. The things that became the touchstone for the rise of the far right in Germany and indeed in Italy were absent completely from the 14 points. So this is something that came after the fact. And we can sort of gloss over that, but it's very significant, because that is the blueprint that Berlin and Vienna thought they were getting when they agreed to the armistice. In the case of Germany, the armistice of the Western Front. That's what they thought they were getting. That's what they were told they'd have to have. And they accepted that, and they didn't get it. They got something else entirely, which was very, very deleterious to international stability. So moving along, just to give you a quick flavour of events, because things were chaotic and very hard to put any shape on. And there are lots of things are happening in lots of places because of the global war. On the 10th of January, 2 days later, the pro-German Don Cossacks declared a republic. And you have an incipient phase of the Russian Civil War, which was that disastrous series, a bloody series of heavy, heavy military campaigns for several years. 2 days later, the Germans occupied Latvia, declared independence. So the Germans were in Latvia, they declared independence. Then Finland did, but Finland then devolved into Reds versus Whites situation of their own political civil war amidst an international war. The British began a new Persian campaign to try and beef up their position there, and the British Empire had about 3.5 million soldiers outside of Europe. So when you think of the British Empire, you didn't see that many colonials on the Western Front, although the Australians and New Zealanders were there, but not in huge numbers. But there's 3.5 imperial forces fought outside of Europe on behalf of London, which is quite something. And these are campaigns we barely look at, and I'm just mentioning it here. There was a lot involved in that. And that, of course, is an attempt to preempt Russian influence, as there always had been, and also to, in an opportunist way, grab what they could of the Ottoman Empire and the pieces, elements around the Ottoman Empire. Similarly, a lot of the chaos in the Baltic states and Eastern Europe were due to the defeat of the Tsarist army, the chaotic situation that had emerged, and German opportunism in encouraging elements that would suit their long-term interests. And really, in 1917, the Red Army, as it became, was not in a position to do much about that. By 1920, 21, 22, they were, but not so much then. So this is, it's partly chance, but it's sort of lots of opportunism is going on here. And of course, people weren't stupid. They're listening to things like the 14 points. So, well, if Poland can have a state, why can't Latvia? It's obvious, and there was a sort of contagion aspect to it for very different reasons. On the 1st of February, Ukrainian independence was recognised. On the 10th of February, Russia declared peace, although it hadn't been negotiated and hadn't been agreed really by anybody. And the Germans didn't agree to peace on the 10th of February 1918. On the same day, Lithuania and Estonia declared independence. Lithuania then came under German control. So, and you have this terrifying wavering between status there, which must have been bewildering for those who lived through it. On the 3rd of March, Brest-Litovsk was signed, and there was the declaration that Poland would be evacuated. Okay. In the 11th of March, something unglamorous happened that became very important. The first known outbreak of what we call Spanish flu was detected in Fort Riley in Kansas. Later that spread to Europe with terrible, terrible effects. My own grandfather spent a year in bed due to contracting it, and many young men were particularly vulnerable to it. On the 21st of March, the sky nearly fell in because the Germans, utilising their temporary ascendancy in the Eastern Front, launched Plan Michael, or otherwise known as the Ludendorff Offensive, which, as I said to you, as you all know, I'm sure, very nearly won the war for them. By the 30th of May, by the way, they were at the River Marne, which they later crossed in places. Now, by not entirely good luck and fortune, but certainly by arrangement, on the 4th of June, substantial numbers of US troops were involved in combat. And the arrival of American soldiers did, absolutely, couldn't have come at a better time and a better place. By the end of the war, there's over 1 million American soldiers in France. And there's something that we should bear in mind there. Much of the south of France was becoming a logistics base for the projected offensive of the spring of 1919. And millions of tons of war material were being stored in France ahead of the 1919 expected decisive campaign against the Germans and the Austrians. But of course that never happened. So we forget this. The Americans were gearing up for a massive military commitment, much more on the scale of World War II. And they were already bringing in changes to their economy to militarize it. Therefore, war capitalism, I suppose. You know what I mean? So war capitalism was happening to make sure they had enough war material. And that was projected for 1919. But even in 1918, it became significant in terms of their contribution. In the month of May, Transcaucasia broke away. So then you had Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia temporarily together on the same page. Then they began to split up independently, declare independence. It's all very, very fluid. In that month, you see something rather ominous. You see the dispatch of British troops to Murmansk, and later then to Archangel, and of course then in Siberia, where they were for a period of months. And later the Americans arrived, Vladivostok and all of that. So you see attempts to try and, on the spurious ground of securing Allied supplies from German possession, you see an attempt to destroy Bolshevism and by commanding the ports that mattered. That didn't work, but you could tell that something could have gone really, really off the rails there had that not been such war willingness and overstretched Allied resources. On the 3rd of June 1918, the Allies declared their support for an independent Poland, Czechoslovakia and what became Yugoslavia. Now that was basically reiterating what the Americans had already demanded as the price of their entry. But of course that has a destabilising effect. At the same month you have the extraordinary situation of the Czech Legion, not entirely Czech of course, multinational but with substantial Czech corps, 100,000 men fighting on the Trans-Siberian Railway. It's something absolutely remarkable. These are major events that get sort of subsumed in so many other major events. A little known battle, but important one, on the 15th of June was the Battle of Piave River, where the Austro-Hungarians were defeated by the Italians. Now the Italians have suffered colossal losses contending with the Austrians and Hungarian forces. Colossal. But this victory paved the way for a second victory that had a considerable impact on the outcome of the war in that sector. On the 10th of July 1918, you have the 5th All-Russian Congress of Soviets, and you start seeing more cohesion of the Bolshevik-Soviet, I suppose, step forward in that point of view. And then on the 8th of August 1918, you have the second battles of Arras, the Marne and the Somme, where you have, finally, the German army being met with significant Allied counterattacks, which did make ground. Now, in May, the Allies nearly lost the war in Europe. In August, it looked quite likely they were going to win it. But the various commanders could not agree a joint strategy, and even those who were nominally in charge were not. The newer arrivals, such as the Americans, were useful because they weren't so basically hors de combat, literally, but not enough. I mean, you see a lot of great claims made about the impact of tanks. Well, the Germans had tanks too, and the better, more flexible tactics in use on the Western Front. Well, that's true. I think there was 500 or 600 tanks, and after 4 days, only 6 of them were working. The rest had been destroyed or broken down. So yes, at times they're very significant, but let's not read too much into this. There was still an awful lot of orderly trench fighting to be done. The critical thing, I suppose, towards the latter stages of the war, was that Berlin realised, particularly when people like Ludendorff and Hindenburg were saying it, that they probably weren't going to be able to permanently hold off the Allies, and they were probably unlikely to be able to defeat the Allied forces in France after August, September 1918. So therefore, overtures of peace towards the Americans, and a lot of it went towards the Americans directly, assumed greater importance. And what you start to see happening is both the Austrians and the Germans begin to comply with some of the prerequisites for peace that the Americans were insisting on, such as preparing to abolish their monarchies, and preparing to further democratize their governments, and things like that. You have the rise of basically a left-wing element in both, particularly in Germany. You see them comporting themselves with a view to pulling themselves out of the war in terms they knew would not be ideal, but could not be catastrophic, because the 14 points is actually quite a positive document from their perspective. Nothing like the armistice terms, or the terms that arose from the armistice. Now, just a quick flavour of this, because there's so much here. We forget about the Turkish army. Yes, the Turkish army had suffered defeat after defeat, but on the 26th of August they began an attack against the British at Baku, and they won. So they still had some bite. Just because the British were getting into Palestine, attacking out of Palestine, didn't mean that the Turks in places like Mesopotamia could not be effective. Our own Tom Barry, of course, was at that direction, and learning some very useful skills. On the 3rd of September, the American government recognised Czechoslovakia. Now, basically, that's done through the mechanism of endorsing the Czech Legion. There's no Czechoslovakia yet. But you have sort of things that are meant to come after the war start to happen during the war when they're still unsettled, which is always dangerous because it didn't have a stabilising effect. It may have had a destabilising effect. The Austrian government make a formal offer of peace on the 15th of September, and they do it directly to Wilson, and they basically said they'd like to do it along the lines of 14 points. Now, Wilson rejected that because the American position was they wouldn't, yes, we're going to go there, but you've got to pull out of all the territory and occupation first. So in other words, it's a conditional surrender. It's not necessarily an unconditional surrender, but they weren't in a position to do it. The following month well actually all throughout the summer months and the late summer, the Allies landed in Salonika in Greece and eventually overpowered the Bulgarians. We don't tend to spend much time worrying about the Bulgarian war effort in World War I in Ireland. It's not something that exercises our minds typically. There might be some exceptions here, but that was a significant front. It's just as one of many. Salonika. We know about Salonika because of Jimmy Crowley and people like that. But anyway, moving along, Bulgaria got knocked out of the war. The Austro-Hungarians began to disintegrate. The Italians enjoyed further military success. On the 4th of October 1918, the Germans and the Austrians offer a peace to the Americans on this principle of the 14 points. Now again, Wilson delayed, but meanwhile the Germans and the Austrians were undertaking those very seismic reforms to their constitutional structure that would have made it possible. Now there was a lot of this. I'm not going to go through it all because it would become tedious, but you can see that there's a genuine desire to negotiate a settlement on terms that the Americans were the guarantors of. Not Paris, not London, but DC. I suppose the Germans started to reform on the 28th of October. The Kaiser began to pull out of government, and then events overtake everything. On the 29th of October, the Austrians are defeated by the Italians effectively. There's no functional governance in that sector, and they collapse. Similarly, the Turkish government signed a separate peace on the 3rd of October and basically agreed to open the streets, agreed to repatriate all prisoners of war unilaterally, and basically agreed to allow themselves to be used as a forward base for the Allied war efforts. That's quite a different thing. But at that point, no actual terms of a treaty had been signed. And we're moving along on the 1st of November, Hungary declared independence. So that's the end of dual monarchy. Dual monarchy's gone then. And then just when things couldn't get any worse, there's a war between Poland and Ukraine because they weren't too happy with who owned what was Polish, what was Ukrainian. These things go back to haunt everybody. The Germans weren't finished in Africa, and on the 2nd of November, the extraordinary von Lettow-Vorbeck invaded Rhodesia from Lake Nyassa. And von Vorbeck was so successful that he couldn't be defeated during the war and held out for 2 weeks after the end of the war. At one point, he caused something like 300,000 Allied casualties, mainly from disease, and he's one of the first people in history to repel an amphibious invasion. So he was some fighter. His cadre of German Marines and African auxiliaries were really quite extraordinary. Now things begin to look very, very dodgy for the Germans. Some will be aware that on the 3rd of November there was a mutiny in Kiel, in that an attempt for one last hurrah to sally into the North Sea and do something nasty with the Royal Navy met with a mutiny which spread, partly due to the spread of socialist ideas in the German military, which was also happening in other armies, very significantly in the French army. The French army was semi-mutinous, and of course there had been actual mutinies, very significant mutinies within the French army, which were harshly dealt with by Paris. Well, on the 3rd of November then, the dual monarchy agrees the complete demobilization of their forces, which means that everything under their control is now available to be negotiated. And this is where it becomes possible to envisage, well, which countries in Yugoslavia are going to be what? Are the Armenians going to have a state over here? Are the Serbs going to have a bit of Kosovo or not? All these things come into question. On the 5th of November, the Allies finally endorsed the American 14 points. And they did so with reservations. They wanted to revisit the issue of freedom of the seas, so they wanted to keep their empires and maybe get more. And they also wanted to introduce this new issue, which is possibly seeking reparations from Germany. Now, it's one thing to require some form of financial recognition when you're in the wrong. And obviously, the Germans were in the wrong. You shouldn't be invading Belgium and Luxembourg and France, right? So there's no question of that. It's just that they did so because they thought the French were coming the other direction. The French had ideas, which they later articulated after the armistice, of detaching the Rhineland completely from Germany, creating a new country. Not just demilitarizing it, making it a different country. dissolving the customs unions in the Germanic frontier with Luxembourg and places like that, which is retarding free movement of goods and services and trade and damaging the German economy. And later, there was some echo of this in quarters of Britain. Famously, Sir Eric Geddes, the First Lord of the Admiralty, who famously said they wanted to squeeze Germany until the pip squeaked, right? That sort of harsh, angry outpouring of dissent with the Germans had some following, but it's not in the 14 points. On the 11th of November, the Germans did, after protracted, intensive negotiations, agree an armistice. But there's a few things about that which need to be said. No Allied soldier was in Germany. The German front line had indeed been heavily compromised, and the most unglamorous thing of all is the main reason for its collapse, which is a section of the rail line between Antwerp and Metz was overrun by the Allies, which made it impossible to supply that part of the front, which made it impossible to maintain that front. So what do? You treat the Rhineland and you fight the river barriers, as they did very successfully in 1945 against insuperable odds. Very successfully. They're going to lose anyway, but you could have done a lot more damage. And then you'd be fighting in German soil. Now, the German economy was in a terrible situation. The naval blockade wasn't just a blockade. The Royal Navy were shelling coastal villages to quite some depth. It's estimated maybe there's something like 250,000 excess deaths in Germany arising from the blockade. Medicine was in very short supply. Distribution of food became very difficult. So, the same thing that happened really in the Second World War in Holland and the Low Countries, where an Allied bombing made it very difficult to actually distribute the food that was there. And you have artificial famines that shouldn't have happened. But anyway, I digress. The naval blockade continued, but the armistice basically said we're stopping fighting. The Kaiser was gone. Emperor Karl had abdicated in Austria. Wilhelm had gone off to, I think, Luxembourg, or no, Netherlands. You have a new government in Berlin from the 10th of November. They were told, sign whatever's on the offer, and then we'll get into it. Now, when they got into it, this is off the course of the topic for today's lecture, that became the Treaty of Versailles, right? But disaster struck, I suppose, from a German point of view. Wilson was unpopular. There'd been a massive anti-war movement in the United States of America, and two of the leading elements of it were the German community, who were very powerful, extensive and numerous. To some degree, the Irish and the Democratic Party were angry at Wilson for not doing enough in Ireland, because they were saying things well before the 1919 delegations and the 1920 overtures. In 1917 and 1918, they were lobbying people like Wilson and the White House for American proactivity in Ireland. Now, it didn't happen in the way that they'd hoped for, but it's one of the reasons why he didn't have a second term, and it's one of the reasons why they lost control of both the Congress and the Senate in the midterm elections in November 1918. So timing couldn't have been worse. Now, meanwhile, Wilson had become the first sitting American president to travel to a foreign country, but they didn't do that, because normally they're isolationists. This is before America as a superpower. They're only just on the cusp of being a great power, but they were on the cusp and they ran with that, particularly with their developments of the automobile and the engineering and capacity rivaling Germany's, which is one of the reasons why there was a post-First World War, is that Britain did not want the increasing pace of German industrialization to be on. Now, that's it in a nutshell. There's so much more to be said about it. But I'm just going to read you a couple of quick statistics, and you can decide for yourself if this is the type of war we thought we had. In 1918, Japan, which was recognized as an Allied power, was given a protectorate of the Marianas, the Carolines, and the Marshalls. Now, they're the bases that they needed and used very successfully in 1941. But the other thing they gained was they gained £183 million in gold reserves. They gained 183 million. So their small cut of the war profit was enough to give them strategic advantage in the Pacific and the money to build a state-of-the-art Navy and Air Force, which made them a great power in Asia. And in many cases they saw themselves being anti-imperialists, but that's a different story. France, the UK, America and Italy were the people who decided what would happen. And again, this is off today's lecture, but put it this way, it is telling that none of those powers agreed on who should get what. Orlando in Italy was devastated by his lack of getting colonies where they thought they were going to get them. They were very angered at the secret deals made between the British and the French, who'd been historically enemies, but the Entente Cordiale was working out quite well. I'll just give you a quick example of that before I finish. Take Africa. Togoland became a mandate divided between Britain and France. Mandate. A mandate. Why is a mandate? Where's self-determination for the people in Togoland? Okay, you're knocking the Germans out of the frame, but you're keeping their gear. Cameroon, divided between Britain and France. German East Africa, Tanganyika, became a British mandate. And German Southwest Africa, where horrendous atrocities have been committed by the Germans, became a South African mandate. In other words, a de facto imperial mandate, because South Africa was in the empire. German New Guinea wasn't German anymore. The Australians got that. I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's called Kiao Chao. Naval base in China. One of the Germans had 3 major naval bases there. That was given to the Japanese. I'm sure the Chinese loved that. German Samoa was given to New Zealand because they helped out in Gallipoli, And you have this horse trading going on everywhere with catastrophically bad consequences for all concerned. Versailles is probably one of the single worst documents, and of course the Americans never signed it. And actually many years later concluded a token nominal separate peace with Germany because the American delegation would not agree to some of the things that were insisted on by the French. So I'll just finish up by saying I knew a lot had happened in 1918, but having a quick look over it again for this talk, I realised, my God, I know nothing about it at all. It's mind-bogglingly complicated, and that is as simplified a version as I can give you. So with that, I shall yield to our discussion.
I have to say, Rowan, that was absolutely fascinating. And I don't know, I differ from everybody else, but I had no idea of the sheer complexity and also the chaos of all the decision making that was going on. We think we've got chaos over Brexit. It looks simple compared to this one. Now, we're going to do questions and answers. And we need to keep it to questions rather than long statements so that we get the best value of having a fantastic lecturer here who can answer the questions. So if we can keep it short, a minute and a half to ask your question, and then we get you the answers. Because we have a resource up here and we don't want to waste the resource. Now, it's exactly 12 o'clock. We started a little bit late, so we'll give 20 minutes, half an hour to this. So, throw it to the floor. Have we got a question?